The flour barrel was nearly empty. That was the only reason Maren Calloway was in Holt's general store on that particular Thursday morning in October of 1879, when the cottonwood leaves had gone the color of old gold, and the first real bite of winter had come down from the northern hills like a warning. She had meant to send her youngest, the boy they called Pip, but he had woken with a cough, and she had wrapped him in wool and told him to stay near the stove. So she had come herself, wrapping her shawl tight against the wind that moved through the gap between the mercantile and the post office. A gap that hadn't existed 13 years ago, when this town was 3 buildings and a hope, before the railroad surveyor came through and declared Harlan Crossing worth a dot on a map. She was 41 years old. She felt, most mornings, considerably older. The store smelled the way it always smelled, of tobacco leaf and dried apple, and the particular sweetness of molasses left too long in the heat of last summer. Old Matthias Holt was behind the counter arguing mildly with a farmer named Dench about the price of lamp oil, and 2 women from the Lutheran congregation were examining bolts of calico near the window, speaking in the low, pleased voices of women who have found an unexpected excuse to stand still for a moment. Maren moved past them toward the dry goods, her list folded in her coat pocket, her mind already back at the house. The bread she had left rising, the letter she owed her sister in Ohio, the cough syrup she needed to measure out for Pip before nightfall. She was reaching for the flour scoop when she heard the bell above the door. She did not turn around. There was no reason to turn around. People came and went from Holt's all morning. It was a Thursday ritual, the midweek gathering of a town going about its ordinary life. The bell above the door had rung a dozen times already. She was thinking about flour. She was thinking about her boy's cough. She was thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. The way a woman of 41 thinks when she has been responsible for a household for so long that her mind runs in parallel channels, each one carrying its own small current of worry and planning and memory. And then, she did not hear his voice. He hadn't spoken. She could not have said afterward what it was. Not a sound, not a movement, not anything she could name with the ordinary names we give to sensory experience. It was something older than that. Something that operated below the level of language, in the wordless register where the body keeps its longest memories. Her hand stopped on the flour scoop. The store went on around her. The 2 women murmured over the calico. Old Matthias and the farmer continued their mild, circular argument about lamp oil. Somewhere a child knocked something off a shelf and someone said, quietly, "Hush now." All of it continued, all the ordinary machinery of a Thursday morning in October in a small frontier town, and Maren stood with her hand on the flour scoop and felt the world tilt very slightly on its axis, the way it does in the moment before you understand something that will change the shape of everything. She turned around. He was standing just inside the door. He had not moved yet from the threshold, one hand still on the door frame, as though he had walked in with some ordinary purpose and then been stopped by something he had not expected, some invisible wall between the door and the rest of the room that only he could see. He was looking at the counter, or he had been looking at the counter, because in the moment that she turned, he turned too, and their eyes found each other across the length of that store with the precision of 2 things that have been aimed at the same point for a very long time. Thomas Aldrin. She knew the shape of him before she knew anything else, before she had registered the gray at his temples, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the way the years had settled into his face, the way weather settles into old wood, changing it and yet somehow revealing it more truly. She knew the breadth of his shoulders and the way he held himself, slightly forward, as though he was always about to move towards something. She knew his hands, She knew, God help her, across all those years and miles and silences, she knew his hands. He was 44 years old. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been tested to the bottom of himself and had found something there that had held. He was looking at her with an expression she could not name. She could not name it because she had never seen it on a human face before. Not like this. Not with this particular quality of arrested motion. As though every forward movement he had made for years had been leading to this exact point, and now that he had arrived, he did not know what to do with the arriving. She had seen men look at women with longing and with love and with hunger and with the specific tenderness of long familiarity. She had never seen a man look at a woman as though she were proof that something he had almost stopped believing in was, in fact, real. She thought, distantly, that she must look something like that herself. They had known each other in what felt, now, like another life. In the spring of 1861, Harlan Crossing had been a settlement of perhaps 60 souls, clinging to the edge of the frontier with the particular stubbornness of people who have decided that this is the place, this difficult, beautiful, demanding place, and no other. Thomas Aldrin had come with his uncle to help work a claim on the eastern ridge. Maren Schroeder, she had been Maren Schroeder then, the blacksmith's eldest daughter, the one with the serious eyes and the habit of speaking plainly, had been 19 years old and possessed of the absolute certainty of the young that life would arrange itself according to her understanding of how things ought to go. What had grown between them had grown the way things grow in hard country. Not quickly, not easily, but with deep roots and real intention. By the autumn of 1861, they had spoken to her father. By December, they had spoken to the pastor. There had been a ring, a simple thing, a thin band of silver that Thomas had ordered from a catalogue and pressed into her hand on a Sunday afternoon behind the church, because he could not wait until Christmas, because he was not, he said, a man who could hold something like that and pretend to patience he did not feel. She had laughed at him. She had laughed, and then she had not laughed, because he was looking at her with those dark eyes that she would spend the next 18 years trying and mostly failing to forget, and she had understood in her bones that this was the real thing, the true thing, the kind of thing that didn't come to everyone and came to no one twice. In April of 1862, the letters from the East had grown impossible to ignore. Thomas had not wanted to go. She had not wanted him to go. These were not complicated feelings. They were simply true. And true in the way that things are true when there is no philosophy or principle involved. Only two human beings who have found each other and do not want to be separated. But his younger brother was already enlisted. His uncle was speaking of duty. And Thomas Aldrin was, underneath everything, a man who could not stand apart from something that needed standing into. He had left in May. He had written through the summer. She had written back, long letters, careful letters. Letters in which she tried to put everything that mattered into the ordinary details of daily life. Because she understood already that the ordinary details were where love actually lived. Not in declarations, but in the particular slant of afternoon light through the kitchen window that she described because she wanted him to be able to see it. His letters had been shorter, more guarded, full of the spaces around what he could not say. But she had read those spaces. She had always been good at reading what Thomas Aldrin could not bring himself to put into words. In the autumn of 1863, the letters had stopped. She had waited. She had waited the way you wait for something, when you are not certain whether the waiting has a purpose, when the silence might mean anything or nothing, when every arriving post rider is both a possibility and a threat. She had written to his regiment. She had written to the War Department in Washington, in the formal, careful hand she had practiced since childhood, and had received back a letter of such profound official vagueness that it told her nothing except that the machinery of war was too large and too indifferent to account for any single man within it. She had written to his uncle, who had by then returned to his people in Kentucky, and who had written back, kindly, she thought. He had tried to be kind. To say that Thomas had been in a regiment that had seen very hard fighting near the Wilderness, that there had been many casualties, that he himself had received no word. No word was not the same as no hope. She had held to that for longer than was perhaps reasonable. She had held to it through the winter of 1863 and into the spring of 1864. And then her father had gotten sick, and the claim had needed working, and her younger sister had married a man named Calloway, who had a farm 2 miles east of town. And life, the relentless, forward-moving fact of life, had begun to do what life does to people who are standing still inside it. She had married James Calloway's older brother, Daniel, in the summer of 1866. He had been a decent man. She wanted to be clear about that, even in the privacy of her own memory. He had been a decent man, steady and fair and not unkind, and she had been genuinely fond of him, in the way that you can be fond of someone who is good to you, and good to your children, and asks nothing of you that you cannot give. He had died of a fever in the winter of 1874, leaving her the farm and 3 children, and the particular kind of loneliness that is different from the loneliness of loss, because it is also, underneath, a form of relief, and the guilt of that relief is its own long weight to carry. She had not let herself think about Thomas Aldrin very often. It was not, she would have said, if anyone had asked, that she was holding something in reserve, keeping some part of herself unspent against a return that reason said was never coming. It was more that thinking about him was like pressing on a place that had healed wrong. It didn't ruin her. She was not ruined. She was a woman who had built a life out of hard materials and was not ashamed of what she had built. But it ached. It had always ached in the particular place where he had lived. What had happened to him was a long story, and she would learn it slowly, over the months that followed, in the way that 2 people piece together the years between them, not all at once, not in a single outpouring, but in fragments offered and received across kitchen tables and evening walks, and the long silences of people who have learned that silence can hold more than words. He had not died, that much was obvious, standing there in Holt's General Store on an October morning in 1879. He had been wounded in the Wilderness, badly enough that for some weeks the outcome was genuinely uncertain, and had spent a long time in a field hospital in Virginia, and then longer in a hospital outside of Washington, in a ward full of men whose names had been lost in the chaos of that terrible spring. He had written, he would tell her, from the hospital. Multiple letters, none of which had ever reached her. He had come back west eventually, years later, a different kind of man, walking back into a world that had arranged itself in his absence. He had heard, somewhere along the way, a returning soldier, a chance conversation, the particular telegraph of frontier settlements in which everyone's business is eventually everyone's knowledge, that Maren had married. He had not, he would tell her, blamed her. He had understood. He had also understood that understanding something and being at peace with it are not the same thing, and that the gap between them can be wide enough to live in for a very long time. He had gone further west. He had worked various kinds of work in various kinds of places, ranch hand, freight driver, for a period an unlikely schoolteacher in a settlement in Colorado where they needed someone who could read and write and maintain order among a classroom of children ranging from 6 to 16. He had not married. He had come close once to a woman in New Mexico who was good and genuine and deserved better than a man who was, at some level he could not fully explain, still waiting for a verdict on something. He had come back to Harlan Crossing because a man he'd known in the war had written him about land available on the North Ridge, and because he was 44 years old and tired of moving, and because he had not let himself think this too clearly, but it was there underneath everything else, a current below the current, because this was the place. This had always been the place. He had arrived the previous evening. He had stayed at the boarding house. He had walked into Holt's General Store on a Thursday morning in October because he needed tobacco, and possibly because he needed something else. Something he could not have named if anyone had asked. And there she was. None of this passed between them in words. Not then, not in those first long seconds in the general store, while the ordinary world went on around them. What passed between them was something else. It was the recognition. That was the only word for it. Recognition, in its fullest sense. The sense that goes back to the Latin recognoscere, to know again. To know something that you knew before and have been, in some essential way, in the act of knowing all along. She recognized the shape of him. She recognized his eyes, dark and steady and holding in them right now something that looked dangerously like 18 years of accumulated silence finding its outlet. She recognized the particular quality of stillness that meant he was feeling something very large and holding it very carefully. And he recognized her. She knew this the way she knew her own name. He recognized the particular gray that had come into her hair. Not all of it, threads of it woven through the brown, silver laid through dark like frost on autumn grass. He recognized the lines at the corners of her eyes, which were the lines of a woman who has squinted into many bright mornings and laughed when there was something to laugh at, and wept when there was something to weep for. He recognized her hands, which had aged as hands do that have worked steadily for 20 years. He recognized, she could see this, she could see the moment it happened, the thing behind all of that, the unchanging thing, the thing that time had left alone because it was made of something time does not reach. Old Matthias Holt had noticed them by now. He was looking from one to the other with the expression of a man who has seen a great many things in 40 years of keeping a store and has learned to recognize the ones that don't require his involvement. The two women at the calico had noticed nothing. They went on with their pleasant, comfortable murmuring. The child who had knocked something off the shelf had been resettled by its mother and was now engaged in a thorough examination of a display of ribbon near the window. All of the ordinary world continued. And Maren Calloway and Thomas Aldrin looked at each other across the length of Holt's General Store, and neither of them spoke. She would think about it later. She would think about it for years, in the way you think about the moments that divide your life into before and after. And she would understand that the silence was not emptiness. It was not the silence of two people who have nothing to say. It was the opposite of that. It was the silence of two people for whom language has, in this particular moment, become entirely inadequate to the task. What was there to say? I looked for you. She had. I thought you were dead. She had thought that too, eventually. Not wanting to, but having no other explanation for the silence that had kept coming and coming with nothing inside it. I mourned you. She had done that, in her own way, quietly, in the way that women on the frontier mourned things they could not afford to let incapacitate them. I married someone else and built a life and raised children and kept going, because there was nothing else to do. All true, all completely, simply true. I never stopped knowing where you were in my chest. That was also true. That was perhaps the truest thing. And there was no way to say it that didn't sound like something from a novel, and she had never been a woman who talked like a novel. And she was fairly certain that Thomas Aldrin, across the room, looking at her with those eyes that had aged and were still completely his eyes, was not a man who talked like a novel either. So they said nothing. He took one step toward her, just one, as though testing whether the ground would hold. It held. She stood where she was, because her legs were not entirely reliable at the moment, and because she was 41 years old, and had learned, at some cost, the wisdom of stillness when you are not sure what movement will mean. He came across the store the way he had always moved, with that deliberateness, that sense of a man who has decided something and is now simply doing it. And he stopped when he was close enough that she could see clearly that his eyes were wet. Thomas Aldrin, who had walked out of the wilderness and back across a broken country and 15 years of solitude, was standing in the middle of Holt's General Store on a Thursday morning with his eyes full of something she had never once seen him let out. Her own throat had closed entirely. She thought, "You have silver in your hair." She thought, "Your eyes are the same." She thought, "Oh." Just that. Just oh. In the wordless place where thinking happens before it becomes language, in the deep place where the body keeps its true accounts. Oh, there you are. There you have always been. Oh. He reached out and put his hand very gently over hers where it still rested on the flower scoop. His hand was rough from years of outdoor work. It was also, unmistakably, the same hand. The hand she had known. The hand she allowed herself this, fully, for the first time in a very long time. The hand she had loved. She turned her hand over beneath his. That was all. She turned her hand over and held on, and he held on, and the store went on around them, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing in language that could hold what they were holding right then, in that ordinary place, among the flour barrels and the tobacco and the bolts of calico, on a Thursday morning in October, in a small frontier town that had changed entirely around the thing between them, which had not changed at all. Old Matthias Holt would tell the story for the rest of his life. He would not embellish it much. He was not an embellishing sort of man. But he would tell it the way it happened, because the way it happened was enough. They didn't say a word, he would say, to anyone who asked and some who didn't. Not one word. Just looked at each other like they were reading a very long letter. And then he walked over and they held hands over my flour barrel. And that was it. That was the whole of it. He always paused there before the end. 40 years I kept that store, he would say. Saw a lot of things. That was the most real thing I ever saw. Outside, the cottonwood leaves went on turning. The wind moved through the gap between the mercantile and the post office. A freight wagon came down the main street, raising a low cloud of October dust. The blacksmith's hammer rang out its steady, ordinary music. 2 boys chased a dog around the corner of the post office and disappeared, laughing, into an alley. The town went about its life. Inside Holt's General Store, Maren and Thomas Aldrin stood with their hands together over a flour barrel, and the years moved through them like weather through an open window, felt and real, and finally let in. She did not forget the flour. She bought it eventually, measured it out with a steadier hand than she would have expected, because she was a practical woman, and the bread was rising at home, and Pip needed his supper. Thomas helped her carry the sack to her wagon. They walked the length of the main street together in the October afternoon, not speaking very much, speaking in the way of people who are still getting used to the fact that speaking is available to them again. She told him about Pip's cough. He said he hoped the boy would be well. He told her he was planning to look at land on the North Ridge. She said it was good land, if you didn't mind the winters, which was something. She said she had to get back. He said yes, of course. She climbed up to the wagon seat and gathered the reins, and he stood beside the wagon with his hand on the sideboard and the October light on his grey threaded hair, and she looked down at him, and he looked up at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there was too much. There was simply too much, and they had both learned in their separate long years that too much, sometimes, is better held than spoken. "Sunday," she said. "The Lutherans have their service at 9. He nodded. She drove home.